Good evening, Eugene. How are you?
I'm great, Jana. How are you?
Great. We are now doing part 2 of our new series with the condensed videos on the comprehensive sexuality education. Many of you tuning in may have already seen part 1, which was the origins of comprehensive sexuality education. And that talked about the philanthropy behind it, all of the money, the trillions being pumped into it. So I'll turn it over to you, Eugene.
Yeah, thanks, Jana. So as I said, we kind of covered off the kind of background from a philanthropy perspective. Here, we're going to talk about the actual how sexuality education evolved. We'll cover some. There'll be a little bit of an overlap to the last section, but a kind of an important overlap because we'll talk about some of the people we kind of mentioned and what their role is as we go through this now. So the next section really is going to cover a lot of what we covered in the original video that we did as part of the Corruption of Irish Education series. So that you're going to get an edited version of that. And we've got some extra stuff. So at the end that we're going to talk through, which is new, which wasn't covered off in that original video. So stay around to catch that at the end. So let's go back in time. And we're going to time travel back to the time of Alfred Kinsey. And some people may have seen the movie with Liam Neeson, 2004 movie, and it's pretty accurate actually. It's not too far off the mark. This man was a sexologist. He founded the Kinsey Institute. They were funded by the Rockefeller Group, and he was big into the whole area and he was originally a biologist, but he got into the whole area of sex and gender, reproduction, etc. And he produced 2 books: The Sexual Behavior in the Human Male in 48. And the Human Female in 53. Now, the one in 48 was really well accepted, and that's really what made him famous. The second book probably wasn't as accepted as well. In society, people found it a bit of issues with it. These were the Kinsey reports, as they were called, and I guess he has influenced the whole area of sexuality and sex education, and we'll see that now when we get into the actual specifications. Now, there were issues. In his document, he documented, and one of his assertions is the whole area of, human sexuality, and particularly the sexuality of children. And the table here is quite disturbing, and I'll talk about it and there's there'll be a link in the description to a whole video that talks about this, that interviews people who worked with Kinsey at the time. The data he got from a paedophile. Now, the paedophile actually used a stopwatch and a notebook while he was, raping the children. This is the only word I can use. And
Eugene, just to jump in there, if I look at the chart there, so if I'm reading it right, sorry, my eyes are tired today. Look, it looks like shocking. 5 months. So he's talking about just
5 months,
5 months old and 11 months old, giving a child an orgasm. And did he explain how he gave the children orgasms? Was this a pedophile who was abusing the children to bring them to orgasm at 5 and 11 months old?
Well, he was claiming they were having orgasms. That was his claim, obviously. Wow. I mean, the numbers, if you look at the numbers, they're pretty horrendous. The time involved was how long he was with the child. So you'll actually see one case down there where he was 24 hours with the child. This is actually really disturbing stuff to read. Now, Kinsey this was a source of data that you couldn't get legitimately, obviously. How could you ever do this research in a university? So, and this guy Green actually he was very meticulous in the way he recorded his data, and Kinsey loved that. That's something he really loved in his career. But unfortunately, this came from a bad source, and the data really, to interpret that this data is saying that children are sexual from birth and are having orgasms and everything. These children were being assaulted. They were in pain. They were crying out in pain. So that assertion, I think, is one of the big issues that people would have with what Kinsey's work came from. So this is disturbing, and this kind of underpins this notion. Now, it's a kind of a Freudian notion as well, I guess, that children are sexual since birth. But where people continue to use that assertion, I think it has to be questioned, and particularly if you're going back to Kinsey's research. So it still had a huge impact. This research has impacted everything. There was a kind of a whole, it kind of was a sexual revolution, I suppose, kind of followed. And it kind of uncovered various sexual practices that people were engaged in. Again, there was some question marks because some of the data was coming from prison inmates, it was coming from prostitutes. So their sexual practices were going to be a bit different than the normal person, and that was kind of skewing the data. So there has been debate as to the extent of the accuracy of some of his data, for sure, quite apart from the child's data that he has. But he does have a huge legacy. There's still people who love him and see him as a very emancipatory character from a sexual perspective. But there's a dark side here as well, and I think we have to keep that in mind because we are talking about sexuality education for children now as we go through this.
I can't
Okay,
imagine any
let's move on
responsible
then.
mother or father
Yeah.
would be happy with knowing that someone thinks it's okay for an age
Yeah.
5 or 7 or 8-year-old to be brought to orgasm.
Yeah.
That's just so disturbing as a mother. I can't imagine anybody would think that's okay.
Yeah. No,
Wow.
those poor children they're just being violently abused.
Yeah.
So we now have to talk about the whole area of Margaret Sanger, and she founded the American Birth Control League, and she went on to ultimately found Planned Parenthood. And this really becomes important. You'll see this when we start talking about the documents, because Planned Parenthood, again, well, some of the background to Sanger, she was huge into the whole area of abortion, sterilization, and eugenics. And there's plenty of videos online, so of her in interviews talking about this. And she had a belief that children who were going to be sick or born into a very poor environment, that they should be aborted, basically. It was eugenics, right? And similarly, black children. She was a racist as well. And in the early days, there was a hugely disproportionate number of black children being aborted by Planned Parenthood than white children, Caucasian children. And even the person who followed her, this guy, Alan Guttmacher, he also he was a president of Planned Parenthood, and then he was also vice president of the American Eugenics Society. So it was kind of running in the organization, right? Obviously, that was the ethos at the time. Now, they've obviously moved on from that, but this was a very bad heritage, and to listen to this lady talk is kind of scary. The way she talks, it really is. So people should check her up online. You'll see interviews with her when she was older. She still had the same views. She talks about it very openly, and it's quite shocking. And Planned Parenthood are kind of a shocking organization. So she eventually founded International Planned Parenthood, IPPF, and that's the one that we're going to be is relevant to our discussions because they have a huge bearing on the standards we're going to talk about. So let's talk about International Planned Parenthood for a minute. So I have a copy of their report, their 21-22 report. There'll be a link to that in the description. And these are the achievements, if you can call them that. 5 million abortions in the time period of the report. 35 million kids getting comprehensive sexuality education, which is one of their huge thrusts. So abortion is one, sexuality education is another. And then they also talk about advocacy wins. And 4 of these were in Ireland, actually, interestingly enough. And we'll get to that in a few minutes as to where that came from. Because, we've had discussions in Ireland regarding the lead time for abortions and, the kind of allowing a cooling off period. And there's been all sorts of debates around that. These Planned Parenthood are also a leading supplier of puberty blockers on a first visit. So within 30 minutes of a first visit, a child can be going out the door with puberty blockers from Planned Parenthood. And then the Irish Family Planning Association, they're a member associate of International Planned Parenthood, and they're the people basically representing them in Ireland. So they're the voice of International Planned Parenthood in Ireland, is the Irish Family Planning Association, just for people to be aware of that. So a former member of Planned Parenthood, a former medical director, Mary Calderone, so again, she comes from that background. So remember, she was medical director for Planned Parenthood and also a follower of Kinsey. She got some money. So the relevance of the picture down below there of Hugh Hefner in the Playboy magazine, Hugh Hefner funded her to set up this group called SIECUS, Sex Education for Social Change. You can see it there. So this is in America, obviously, it's in the US, and she founded this organization. And again, she was big into the whole Kinsey type view, and again believing that children are sexual from birth and all that kind of thing. She again was feeling that society was too repressive, and we needed to open up in terms of sexuality and all of that. It was basically a sex positive movement. SIECUS are and closely aligned with the International Planned Parenthood in terms of their ethos. So that's what we're talking about here. They would have been the kind of the early generators of comprehensive sexuality education. So we'll see that now in a minute. And she wrote in her book there, "Children are sexual, think sexual thoughts, do sexual things." So that's her viewpoint. Obviously, she's following on from Kinsey's research. So this is an interesting thing. It's from one of the reports. If we have enough room, we'll stick it in the description. And it talks about, they're basically slagging off the whole notion of abstinence-only sex education. And there's been a huge debate about this in the US over the years. And they're making kind of assertions here that regarding that, which I think are kind of unfounded and a little bit outrageous, to be honest, because they've got their own agenda. So you can argue this both ways, but I think this kind of shows you the mindset and the ethos. And this is so important because this is what runs through the comprehensive sexuality education. It's the ethos of Planned Parenthood. It's the ethos of SIECUS that's in the guidelines. And when we look at those guidelines, we'll see where that comes through. So this is why it's important to look at the root of this. So that's a comment. And then there's this other group, World Association for Sexual Health. It used to be the World Association for Sexology, which kind of sounds kind of cultish or something, but they changed their name. These are also cited by the WHO. And they cite their kind of sexual rights declaration. So you'll hear this statement that everything, regarding sexuality education is rights-based. People keep using that term, rights-based. The rights they're talking about, there's only one right, and I'll get to it, that's linked to the United Nations human rights. All the others are rights asserted by groups like WAS and IPPF, which nobody is going to be following. You don't have to follow those rights. These people are just making statements that these are children's rights. So to quote that these are rights that you're going to be following is ridiculous. These are NGOs. So these people, they've got this statement, and they've also got a declaration of sexual pleasure. If you go on Wikipedia or you go on their website, you can find it. So again, this is the kind of organization that's influencing the sexuality guidelines. You can kind of see a theme here.
So the theme is really they believe
kind of
children. They believe children are sexual at birth. They believe children have rights and the rights to be sexual at a young age, as long as there's consent involved.
Yeah. So these are the first sexuality guidelines. Came from SIECUS in 1990. From the K to 12, as they call it in the US, the kindergarten to 12th grade. So this was the first comprehensive sexuality guidelines. This is kind of the precedent for everything that was going to follow. And we'll try to put a link into that. They only have the latest version, but at least you'll see where it comes from. And really, SIECUS and Planned Parenthood, because you saw the comment on the Planned Parenthood report about the 35 million kids that got sexuality. These are the two groups that are huge into sexuality education. It's Planned Parenthood in the US, and it's International Planned Parenthood, IPPF, outside of the US. So they're the big groups pushing this. This is another one, and we'll skip through this quickly. This is important because there's another group involved here, Advocates for Youth. You can see that young, powerful taking over, right? That's the kind of tagline for Advocates for Youth. I did want to talk a little bit more about Advocates for Youth because I think it kind of gives you a representation of some of what's going on here. And you'll see that the tagline from their website here. This is we put the link in the description to their website. So I didn't realize that sex education was tied to social justice and liberation. So join thousands of youth activists and adult allies as we build a better and more equitable world. I mean, this is really something, right? This is the critical theory coming out, this kind of activism element coming out. And this has been promoted in our classrooms, unfortunately. And that I wanted to use Advocates for Youth as an example. Now we haven't gone through critical theory yet. And critical pedagogy. We'll be covering that in the next video. But this is just to give you an example of how this manifests in the real world. So you can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to separate themselves from their parents. The children the young people need to take the lead, right? You can see the tone of what's going on here. The sexual rights, their children's sexual rights, this kind of stuff that you hear from the United Nations.
So children have the right to be sexual beings. We saw after the whistleblower interview, we saw some of the papers from the doctors in academia here in Ireland who believe childhood innocence is a barrier and who believe that children are born sexual beings. So this here does link directly into that, the social justice, the liberation, sexual health and rights. Nobody should ever think a child is a sexual being, and we should never accept minor attracted persons as normal or acceptable.
The other aspect here is the politicization, activism, bringing that into the classroom, and we kind of see that. Mm-hmm. So what else are advocates for youth about? Well, look at this: racial justice and equity. I mean, this is just like a hard left organization for young people. That's what it looks like to me. This is their kind of BLM wing. And then here they talk about fighting the harmful parents' rights attacks, right? Do you see what's going on here? Separating the rights of parents from their children. That's what's going on here.
And we've seen other countries, Eugene, where children have been transitioned or, pushed down the transgender path behind their parents' backs. So parents haven't had the right or been involved in the decision to give young children things like puberty blockers or chest binders or any other one of those harmful, life-changing interventions. So you can see where this is going.
Now, another thing about advocates for youth, which people may not be aware of, is the Amaze videos. Mm-hmm. So they are the people responsible for the Amaze videos that we are familiar with in Ireland, because a number of them are actually referenced by the HSE and the Department of Education in their toolkits, as we know. Now, they're not yet advising about the particular video we have here, which will kind of show a little clip from this particular video as we're talking on abortion with pills. What is it? And this is a pretty vile video that we know is being shown to children in Australia as part of their sex education. And we have that from Rachel, from the session we did with Rachel Reed from Australia.
Even if this video that we're going to show isn't being shown to children in the classroom, children in the classroom in Ireland have Amaze in their school textbooks with some other references. So you can be sure that kids who have phones or tablets, if they're being recommended this wonderful company Amaze in their textbooks, they're going to go on YouTube and they will come across these videos because this company is being endorsed by the Department of Education.
The Wellbeing. So Wellbeing, the sex education, SPHE, RSE comes in under this Wellbeing banner. And these are the things that are happening. So they are promoting effectively radical feminist theory, including gender identity, under this gender equality SDG 5. That's really what they're promoting. Girls to focus on their careers, the workplace opportunities, freed from, starting a family or getting involved in marriage or motherhood in any way. And it's all back to that original agenda on population control, right? And then children can select what gender they want to be.
It's about the state wanting to have an overreach and raise our children. So we want to have, mothers, don't give them a choice to stay at home. Don't make it financially possible. Mothers have to work, drop their kids off to be farmed out to childcare all day. The only time that some parents see their children is to put them to bed at night. The schools now want to medicalize the children through all of the medical interventions and vaccines given at schools. They want to feed the children. We've seen the hot lunch programs. They want to teach your children about sex. The state want to raise your children.
They talk about inclusive sexuality education. That's only an excuse. It's the promotion of non-reproductive sexual practice. That's what they're doing. That's why they put such an emphasis on masturbation, as we know, a huge emphasis on it, and things like anal sex and oral sex and rimming and fisting, etc., scissoring, BDSM, anything that's not going to lead to in any way having children. That's what they're promoting. Sex for pleasure, and without any scope of marriage or anything like that. And we see this. This is the ethos in the education of the sex education, the RSE and SPHE in our schools right now. It's the ethos that came from the DCU course.
They're going to be taught about sodomy at school. But if they decide to have traditional, sex, whether they're of age or not, these are the times. Don't worry, those children, if they do get pregnant, they will teach them how to access abortion. So they've got that covered.
Oh, yeah. So, and again, we'll cover it in the queer theory video. Everything heteronormative is oppressive, right? Your marriage, family, male-female relationships, heteronormative language, even childhood innocence. These things are all oppressive. They're bad things. And this dumbing down, this whole school basis, pushing things like well-being, social justice, climate change, sustainable development, global citizenship into every single class, every day in the schoolroom, at the expense of the other subjects. And this is what's coming right now from UNESCO, and it's coming in spades. It's absolutely, it's horrendous.
It's not just good versus evil. It's also truth versus lies. So the same way that, transgenderism is selling a child a big lie, because we know that you cannot change sex. They're selling the climate alarmism as one big lie that the Earth's going to blow up. Well, from what we've learned from the part 1 video, Eugene, is that when we talk about carbon, we are the carbon they want to reduce.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So there's a whole other discussion on climate to be had, and I'll kind of allude to it in the next few slides as well. But the last point here is this replacing rational critical thinking. They don't want people developing that. They want this critical theory, critical Marxism, inspiring children to be change agents for social transformation to a more sustainable, inclusive, and equitable society. That's the exact words they use. That's the words that DCU use, the NCCA use in their documents. So we can clearly see that the origins of comprehensive sexuality education have very little to do with children's well-being. It's a Malthusian population control agenda from day one. That's what it started out as. Now it's actually evolved over time. There's a desire to undermine Christianity, and we know the reason for that, because obviously Christianity is going to be against these things. It's going to be in opposition to these things. So you want to get rid of it. And this social engineering. So sex education has become a vehicle for social engineering. There's no doubt about it. And it's now being used big time for that function, with the likes of UNESCO sitting in the middle of it, with their guidelines and what they're pushing. And now, we did focus on the Rockefeller and Ford Foundation, so I don't want to focus all on them because they're not the only ones. Bill and Melinda Gates have kind of taken over the mantle from the Rockefeller Foundation to a large degree in terms of funding International Planned Parenthood, funding gender equality. They're big funders of that right now. And of course, we have George Soros, Warren Buffett, again, big funders of abortion, etc. And of course, the United Nations are the front for all of this. They're the people that are setting the agenda. And of course, people like Micheál Martin in Ireland and all of our Irish government and our Irish civil service will lap up everything that comes from the United Nations. How high, basically, is the response. So this Malthusian agenda has now transformed into this climate change agenda. As you were kind of saying, Janet, this is basically what it's become. It's become all about climate change now, the climate crisis, the existential risk due to the climate change caused by humanity, and it's this threat. And so now we must indoctrinate the children, and we must engage in these drastic investments. And so no wonder they're pushing that agenda. Is it any surprise? Because there's trillions of dollars involved in it.
Not directly related to education, but related to something that should be important to anybody listening, which is our food supply. And in addition to with the climate change agenda, they are covering hundreds and hundreds of acres of Ireland's beautiful, rich farmland with things like solar farms and wind farms, which are not green, are not climate friendly, do not promote biodiversity, but it's done under the green umbrella. So feeding on the grass, and that's also part of this agenda.
Yeah, it is. And the other point is that the Western countries are the people expected to do all the hard yards on this. There's nothing happening in China or India or Russia. So how come it's all the Western countries have to go to net zero, and yet all of these other countries don't have to go to net zero? There's obviously something else going on there. No, the gender lie was a bad one, and this is another bad one, unfortunately. People are familiar with the COP29 meeting that happened recently. So there was a document produced from the COP29 meeting, as there tends to be. They tend to produce these documents afterwards. You can see it here. With a link in the description to it. It's got various principles mentioned in it. So the summary here is this is promoting a wealth transfer from what I'm calling big government, because they're asking government to do things that are an overreach, basically. Justified on the basis of climate change and existential risk to large corporations and their wealthy owners. So this is this wealth transfer that's going on. And then the indoctrination of children and youth, which is actually a principle. If you read Principle 3 in this document, it talks about it. They want children and youths to believe that this is true and this is the right thing. We have to take these measures to save the planet, because if we don't do, we won't save the planet. That's basically what they're indoctrinating the children into believing. And unfortunately, if you're only watching the mainstream media, they're not going to tell you anything about this. They won't tell you this document exists, for example.
A lot of our followers message us to say that their children are coming home from school terrified, or some words that we've heard: terrified, fearful, anxious, traumatized. One came home crying and shaking. It was a little girl who was on the autism spectrum, came home and said, "I'm not going to be able to have children." And the mom said, "Why?" Once they calmed their child down, and they said, "Because the earth won't be here. It's going to blow up," because that's what they learned in school. So this is not, we look at our mental health crisis. Mental health crisis is through the roof. And we look at this added anxiety, pushing this on children, this fear and anxiety, in addition to teaching them that they might be born in the wrong body. What are we doing to the children today?
So hopefully between these two videos, the first one we did on philanthropy and on this one, that'll have given you an insight as to how insincere what's happening in education is, and also what's happening in the main society as well. This is the top level stuff, but there's stuff happening on the ground as well. You need to understand, and that'll what the other videos in this series will go through, the mechanics of how they've been pushing these things, the various ideologies that they're using. So they're using ideologies that have been developing in academia over the years, and they've decided to mainstream them.
Okay, well, that's great, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Please do share this, and thanks for watching the second part. And hopefully you saw the first part. And stay tuned for part 3 of this. And see you soon.